My name is Whitney Lytle. We're with Northwest Vista College, and we are talking about the inaugural field school archaeology class. Currently getting my PhD with UTSA.
Our future Dr. Lytle is working on a dig with the Northwest Vista students, and Dr. really did a cruise over here. And we can't wait to hear what you have to share with us, what you can share with us, and introduce your students on that wondrous little exercise over there. Ms. Lytle.
Thank you guys for inviting me out here. I'm super excited to be involved in the region, and Adam and I worked really hard to kind of get this going, and Adam especially was working on it for years before I even became involved. But as an instructor, it's really fun. One of my goals in archaeology has always been outreach efforts and education. I love working with UTSA students when we have a field school in Belize, and we have field school students come down there. And I've always been really interested in creating something that's more accessible to students here in San Antonio. So the opportunity to do this field school course was really exciting, and several of the wonderful students from this semester, so Kristen, Hunter, and Everett, were there. They were our guinea pig students for the field school, and so they got to be part of the does equipment come in on time, and does it all work, and do we have enough, since we didn't know. Really didn't know what we were going to find when we started digging. We had an idea of what's found in the region, but as far as what we were actually going to find when we started digging, we didn't really know. I've done some work in Texas, but none right here around Somerset. And so I, again, had a general idea of what we were looking for, and we ended up finding actually a lot more than I was expecting. I was going to be excited if each student found one artifact and during the semester. I just was at my house going through trying to find some of the more interesting things that they discovered. I mean, we have bags and bags, so it's been really amazing.
My name is Adam Aguirre, and I'm the anthropology discipline coordinator. I'm the head of the anthropology department at Northwest Vista College. I'm really excited. This was the inaugural class. This was the first class, so we're excited to get more students out there, and hopefully this is just the tip of the iceberg.
Especially for, it's sort of jam-packed into a short period of time. We met on Fridays. The last Friday was our last meeting for the semester, at least until the next class, hopefully in May. And we found all sorts of things. We found prehistoric artifacts, and we found historic artifacts. Most of our units got to only about 30 or 40 centimeters, which is about this deep, and then we had one unit that when you stood in it came up to about my shoulder. So we had a lot of variety as far as the type of soils we were working in and everything. I brought some of the artifacts, some of the more interesting. I pulled just a few samples to give you guys an idea of what the students are finding. As far as how the students are working out there, we went over a lot of methods that would be applicable in the field of archaeology. If they actually were going to get a job in archaeology, they learned some of the basic methods that you would need to know, particularly for cultural resource management. And cultural resource management is something that is done throughout the country. It's mostly done on public lands where if any kind of construction is happening, it's part of the law to have archaeologists come out and do a survey. I'm sure you've all heard of environmental surveys that happen. Very similar to that. Archaeologists go out and they just test the area to make sure that any cultural material is recorded. It's actually pretty rare for them to stop construction. I mean, as all of you know, stopping construction in San Antonio, every time you hit something that's part of history, we'd never build anything. There's so much here in and around San Antonio. So a lot of times it has to do with collecting the information properly, making sure it's recorded, and that construction can continue. So that's one of the most common types of careers for an archaeologist to have. It's certainly one of the first jobs you get out of your bachelor's. I've worked for a couple different companies, and I wanted to make sure that the NVC students get those skills that even when I first started, I had never done any of the things that I was supposed to do working that job. I had to learn it all on the job. So I wanted to kind of take away some of that anxiety, and it also helps them be more hireable when they're out in the field, or if they're applying for graduate school after their bachelor's, they'd be able to say that they already have these skills and that experience. So they went over all those sorts of methods, and then hopefully after a few more field schools, we'll have enough artifacts that we'll do either a field school class or an archaeology class where we're going to be going through all of the artifacts and teaching them lab methods and analysis methods, and we get to learn a little bit more about the details of what we're finding out there. So we have sort of long-term plans with the field school. Luckily, these are not the normal bags that we have our artifacts in. But again, I kind of quickly pulled from our normal bags to bring them out here, as opposed to bringing a giant box of things. As you can see, one of the important things that students learn is context of artifacts, and it's one of the reasons why archaeologists encourage, even on private lands where it's perfectly legal to collect artifacts if they're on your own private land. But the reason archaeologists discourage it is because the artifact itself, though interesting, once it's removed from context, we lose really any of the information that we can gain from the artifact, especially if it's something unique. A lot of times people think, oh, it's the best to find something that's one of a kind. Well, it's actually the hardest because you need to compare it to other things, be able to understand the context in which it comes from, to be able to figure out what that unique thing is. So one of the biggest parts of archaeology is recording where you found something, including the depth of which it was found, which particular unit. We even had several guest speaker archaeologists come out. One that does, she records sites via drone. So they had drones come out, and they all got to experience flying drones. And then we had an archaeologist on the last day that came out using a total data station to record the location of all of our units. And that's when, a lot of times you'll see these guys standing on the side of the road, and they've got the tripod and the construction vests, and someone's holding a big stick. So it's that, and we record in where all of our units are, and they tie it in through satellite. So we know exactly what artifact comes from what unit, what level they found it in. So even though I pulled these out to show you guys, I had to make sure that I recorded the exact information that was on all of their bag tags, so these can go exactly back into where they need to go when I get them back to the lab. So we'll be storing these at the Center for Archaeological Research at UTSA. So they will have a chance to actually volunteer to go there and wash the artifacts. Most of these are unwashed. I washed a couple of them just to make them nicer to see, but most of them are unwashed and waiting for students to get some volunteer opportunity and lab work in. So I don't know if you guys are interested in kind of hearing any of the, I don't want to put them on the spot, but if any of them want to say anything about their experience.
I had no idea coming into this. I am an anthropology major, and I would like to, decided now that I would like to focus on bioarchaeology, which is more specifically studying humans within the archaeological context. But this field school has been really amazing and really valuable for me because I've gotten to have really hands-on training and see exactly what is expected in the field. And not only that, but have a better context for humanity and living in general and how important history is for all of us.
I really enjoyed it, and I really enjoyed the speakers she had come out to us too, because she didn't have to do that, but these were resources that helped us figure out our career path that we want to go down. And you learned a lot about archaeology and how there's even subfields in archaeology too, and it's pretty cool. I really enjoyed the class though.
My name is Victoria, but I go by Ever. And one thing I took from this class is that it really showed me appreciation, because a lot of what we know from history, like you said, is from archaeology. There's a lot of looting going around, and people have not accurate perceptions of why you can't be looting. And there's a lot of, not as much as appreciation for a lot of historical artifacts and buildings around, and especially with industrialization, a lot of it can be skewed. So now that I'm more aware, I'm like, okay, that's nice.
How come y'all picked that area?
Honestly, it was through my partnership with Rudy de la Cruz. He had connections here to Somerset and Von Army and the communities down here. And so when I started, well, he actually approached me about getting involved with some of the interdisciplinary projects that he was working on. And I said, well, you know what I'd really love is I'd love to have an archaeology field school. And he said, okay, I'll put that on the list. And so as he was doing his research and his work, he started talking to private property owners about that possibility. And we went through about 2 or 3 before we found this property, and it went through. So this area is, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it's been relatively untouched by archaeologists for a while.
Yeah, especially because again, archaeologists really aren't working on private property, and there's no call for it. It's not. Archaeologists don't just go around and like try and dig people's stuff up. We have to usually be called out to do that. Any disturbance that usually happens is by either different property owners or as the land is changed hand, used for different things, construction, building of different things, putting in pipes even just for water pipes and electrical, stuff like that. So that's the type of normal disturbance that you kind of expect to see. When you have farming and things like that, we don't expect people to stop farming, but we can see that disturbance when archaeologists do go out there. And other than that, we have regular kind of natural disturbance that happens with tree growth and flooding and droughts and things like that. So, and archaeologists are trained to kind of try and understand that type of disturbance. The first day when they learn how to do survey methods, which includes surface survey, but also shovel tests, which are what they will most likely be doing the most of CRM work. And that's basically you dig a 1 meter deep hole, and it's really hard to get all the way down to 1 meter. But you do that, and you're recording any artifacts that may come up. And we did that actually closer to the river. And unfortunately, closer to the river, we're too much on a floodplain. So they didn't find, I don't think we found anything in any of the shovel tests. And I think they were able to, in total, complete like almost 20 shovel tests that day between all of the students. And I don't think one artifact came from any of it. So that's another reason why we decided to dig. We were further up, so we're kind of above that floodplain. So even though we are above that floodplain and we find lots and lots of artifacts, one problem we're running into, at least as far as being this early in our investigations, is that we have a lot of mixed contexts, which means we're finding things like glass, metal, a lot of historic things that are more recent, and then we'll find right next to those things a blade that's prehistoric, probably dates back to 1,000 years ago, all within the same level. So what we probably have here, we have lots of farming around, and so we're probably getting a lot of plowing. A lot of that soil has been kind of mixed. So, and not to mention there's also problems in Texas with the types of soil we have, and when we do have flooding, I'm sure you guys have all seen it, when it gets really dry and you get those big cracks in the ground, what can happen is artifacts that are in the ground can fall in those cracks, so you get historic things that are lower than they should be. But as it gets all wet, it expands and it actually can push things up. So we get prehistoric things that are up higher than they should be. So it's not too uncommon for Texas for this type of thing to happen. And all it means is that we're going to have to keep working to find more distinct levels so we can figure out at what point we are really in purely prehistoric area as opposed to the historic. So it'll just mean we got to keep working. So about 10 years ago, I was working for UTSA running their public outreach program for the Center for Archaeological Research. And someone brought in all of these weird shaped rocks and was telling me they were fossils. And I was like, I don't know what these are. And they were like, oh yeah, I've got buckets and buckets of them. I'm like, I don't know what these are. And we get a lot of people asking what to identify things. And when it comes to fossils, that's usually predates my knowledge, but I try and help people anyway. And they had brought in buckets of the same kind of weird shaped rock, and it's like, I don't know. And a friend of mine who was the assistant coordinator at the time, she knew exactly what they were because she's from Texas, and they're fossilized clams. And apparently, they have a name, and now I can't remember the name, but she said, oh yeah, they're everywhere. She's like, everybody property has all these fossilized clams. Yeah, they're all about like this big. And so as soon as she said it, I was like, oh, that's exactly what there's fossilized clams, but I don't know that. So that was when I first learned about how covered in water Texas really was at one point. So it's the fossil history here is just as interesting as all of the human history that we have. Yeah, amazing.
How do you determine, do you like have a list, or like there's like these 15 places where you want to dig? How do you determine where you're going? What?
So it can vary. Most of the time, archaeologists are working because they're associated with that cultural resource management, and you get calls from different companies because again, they're required to have archaeologists come out. So you get calls from the companies, and they usually call multiple CRM firms, and then those firms will say a bid, say, okay, it will take us this long for this much to get the work done that you need, and then they can pick from the archaeology companies from that. So that's how CRM gets their jobs. In our case, Adam worked with different landowners. This took a couple shots, but
Well, Rudy de la Cruz, who you mentioned a second ago, he was the one who was introducing me around to some of the landowners, mostly in this area, including Land Heritage Institute, who I see referenced here in your work. And yeah, eventually we met the Browns. That's how we ended up there.
Gotcha.
And then, so as far as other academic groups, a lot of times if it's work in Texas, it is usually work with private landowners. That's usually how sites worked out. So a lot of archaeologists work further west. Most of them work on private landowners, and they invite them to come out and work on their property. So especially in Texas, archaeologists outside of CRM really value advocates, private property owners and advocates of history who allow archaeologists to come out and kind of collect that information because so much of Texas is privately owned and has very different state laws compared to other states. So sometimes how you choose sites is dependent state to state, place to place. It's a lot easier for me when I work in Belize because you can't stick a shovel in the ground without finding something, but also, you see this big old pyramidal mound, you're like, I think something's there. So it's a little bit easier to identify where sites are in that case. So it really varies, but finding the specific place to work, then like what we have to do on is a matter of survey and testing. You don't always find something. You kind of pick, okay, we know we're near a river, it's a good chance of finding people who are living there. So then it's just kind of identifying where, and so you do all that testing.
Okay.
We were finding a lot of the mussels, the mussel clams that are from the river, but they're way up where we are. So that's not going to happen through natural circumstances. That's showing us that that is a food source. People are bringing that up there. Mm-hmm. So they're going down to the river, collecting those clams, bringing them up to where they're probably living, and breaking them open and cooking and eating them there. So that's one of the reasons that we collect not only artifacts, things that people made, but also ecofacts, which are things like animal remains. And then, because that can kind of tell us what people are eating.
That's your Apache and Seminole Indians.
Seminoles
Seminoles come from the coast.
Right, so we're more,
Apache.
this area would be, there'd be some Apache, Comanche, probably.
I keep out of those.
Yeah, and so And some of what we're finding, we may not actually have a proper name for the Native Americans that were living there, because that's sort of a problem that happened. A lot of Native American groups, the names of them were identified by the Europeans that arrived, and them not understanding how the divisions of different tribes were. So a lot of the names of groups that we use today are not potentially accurate for what we find in the prehistoric record, especially when we're going back, 2,000 years, because then they could be even different than when the Europeans arrived, let alone the, misconceptions of how they were labeled once the Europeans got here. So we have a hard time kind of identifying exactly which Native American groups might have used these. We can get an idea of who existed at certain times here. But then when we're looking at some of our really old artifacts, so for instance, we have one arrowhead here. I wouldn't be able to say necessarily which groups use this, but I'd have a better chance of identifying that as opposed to another artifact we have, which is a large blade and probably predates that arrowhead by at least a few hundred years. Again, found in the same lot, but it's definitely much older. And then we wouldn't be able to necessarily say what group made that, because we don't exactly know what they would have called themselves. So we just call them the prehistoric Native American group. So on their bags, again, I can't really pass them around in case that they get mixed up from their bags in context, but I can put them out here and I can kind of tell you about them. And then everyone can kind of just come over here and take a look. Have identified yet, because it does take, it's not just the collecting but also the lab work afterwards, and we have not had a chance for that. But we have some ceramics here. These are some older ceramics that may be prehistoric or just very, very early historic. And when I say prehistoric, by the way, I'm speaking before Europeans. We kind of use that as a blanket term to mean before written history here. So it's kind of a general time period.
What about dinosaurs?
Dinosaurs, that is outside of my purview. Yes. So,
Hold that up.
yes, this is most likely white-tailed deer. So it's teeth right here. And again, because this is, obviously we could have white-tailed deer that's not very old because we're still around here. But because we have this mixed context, I'm not exactly sure to what point this dates. So one of the more interesting and first things that we found, this was found by Ever's team there, is this ring. I'm not sure what kind of metal it is just yet. We're still kind of debating. But it has initials on it, and it's the initials SW. So that is a really interesting piece, because that also kind of has that human connection, because you have actual initials on it. So it's really interesting find there. So that was one of our first really exciting finds.
Yeah, it definitely gets you excited, especially like
Seashell.
it depends on like what you find too.
Yeah.
So I actually came across the arrowhead and the blade, and I was really excited because you think about it and it's like our ancient ancestors are over here like actually sitting here making this stuff, and it's like to think about that and it's like, wow, somebody touched this from way back then, just living off of hunting and gathering stuff. And here I am and I'm finding it, and I wish I could keep it, but you know, you gotta because it's so cool. Yeah.
So these are some examples of different types of flakes. We find a lot of these. I think everybody found some of these. They're made out of flint, or we call it chert, which is just a type of flint. And one of the things, and the reason I grabbed these in particular, is because it shows different types of different stages of production. Because one of the things that we're looking at, and flakes are basically the process of making the stone tool, where they're knocking away pieces of the chert in order to shape that tool, whatever they're trying to make. But flakes are actually extremely interesting, even though it might not be as cool looking as the final product of a spear point or an arrowhead or something like that. Flakes are actually really interesting because we can see what levels of production are happening at that place. So for instance, this piece right here, you see the outer area of the rock. It's called the cortex. And then on the inside here, we call this a primary flake. So that's the beginning stage of production. Where there we have secondary, where you have a little bit of that outer bit of cortex. And then these where you have none of the cortex, they're usually a bit smaller, and they're just that nice chert. Those we call tertiary. So that's the final stage production. So sometimes we might just find primary and secondary stage, and that would show us that, okay, they're just knocking this off, they're getting just the raw material they need, and then they're leaving with that big core of that nice raw material, and they're bringing it back somewhere else. But if we find also, you know, the tertiary, that final stage, then we know they're also sitting there in that area, and they're creating the final product as well. And sometimes we just find the tertiary, where we know that they have obviously transported that core from somewhere else. They already kind of narrowed it down to what they need, and so we just have that final stage. And then we also have a particular shape of flake that's long and thin like this. And that particular shape is called a blade flake. It's from a blade core. That's a specific shaped core where they're making a particular type of stone technology. So you have this long, skinny blade shape. They're forming a particular shape of core to make a particular type of tool. This is her really cool find. This is, I'm not 100% sure because again, I have to do some work in the lab. This, I believe, is going to end up being a bison or buffalo tooth. It's very similar to a cow tooth, but it's a lot fatter. And it has this little extra ridge. And that little extra ridge is usually found on bison and buffalo as opposed to cow. So you know, when you guys come by, you can pick it up and take a look. We haven't cleaned it yet or anything. But most likely that's what that tooth is going to be from. So that's a very exciting find. Bone is something we are, if we send samples of bone, we can get good dates back on what bone is. But we do know that already that we have a really mixed context here. We have stone tool making technology as well as things that you would maybe still have around your house today. So this is from Hunter's, one of Hunter's units here. And it includes one of the larger, this is the tool that I was telling you about. That's the larger prehistoric blade tool in the same context as this little arrowhead. And these would be separated by at least hundreds of years, if not more. You can see, so arrowheads also, to give you an idea of how to identify arrowheads, they're not just all of the sharp triangular pieces. Arrowheads are a very specific technology that's actually not nearly as old. They're all tiny like this. In Texas, I know there are a lot of times called bird points, and those are actual arrowheads. Anything larger than 2 inches is too big to be an arrowhead. So it's more likely a spear or a dart point. And what's interesting about this arrowhead, it was actually modified. So, you know, it has this little stem on one side, and it should have that same little stem on the other side, but it broke. But if you look very closely, you can see where they actually chipped away at the edge to give it kind of a rounded shape, and it made it so they could reuse it. So we have evidence of kind of recycling and reusing, repairing on this. And it would be a lot easier to see with a microscope. You'd be able to see all of the fine edges where they...
What we call birds and small animals.
Right. So those are actually arrowheads. So those would have still been used to hunt deer and things like that. And anything larger than that actually predates that technology. And then this tool here is interesting. And this one, I actually didn't know the purpose of this, and we happen to have a guest speaker out who does a lot of CRM work. And he was familiar with this particular type of tool. This would have been probably set in a long piece of wood, and it would have been set like this, and would have been used as a scraper, either for processing leather or scraping wood and things like that. So I wasn't even familiar with this shape here in Texas, but luckily it was found on the day that we had a visitor who did know. So, and here's some of that river shell. Again, that they're finding a lot of that up where we are, so we know that they're transporting it down from the Medina River, bringing it up there where they actually have residents, where they're cooking and eating it. And then lastly, have some of our historic finds. So things that people might really recognize. So different tools, sometimes when we find nails or different types of bolts and things like that, we can sometimes date them based on technology. Nails are usually really easy if they're wire pulled nails, if they're machine cut nails, things like that. You can usually get a really good date. We found a lot of glass, and different colors of glass can sometimes be dated. And then we can also look at shapes. If we have really distinct, areas of the glass, either the base or the neck of a glass bottle, it's a lot easier to identify when it came from, and what you would do in order to figure that out is you would sit in the lab with a cleaned up glass with a glass catalog, and you would look page by page, finding all of the distinct markers of the glass. So in the lab, it's usually the idea of for every one day you spend in the field, you're going to spend a minimum of 3 days in the lab. That's the usual math that we do. But we also have a fitting here. This would be for electrical work in older homes. They would have the electrical wire would be on here, so we've got that. And then this little lid to a ceramic container, maybe a salt or sugar jar or something small like that. So if anyone wants to just get up, and you feel free to pick things up and take a look. Again, most of them are still dirty, so you'll feel grimy hands afterwards. But one of the things that the students do is they actually record the colors and texture of the soil that they're working in for every level. And that can help us in the future in the lab. A lot of times, when necessary, we'll take actual soil samples back with us. And you can find even pollen. Pollen will last for thousands of years, and you can do testing for that. The only time that we wouldn't wash an artifact because of what residue might be on there would usually be with older ceramics. Sometimes we won't scrape out or wash the inside because you can take scrapings and see if there's any residue of any foods or whatever was stored in there, and you can test for that. It's actually one of the ways that archaeologists learned what the shape of Maya chocolate pots were, is they had an idea because they were seeing particular paintings on pottery or in the written records of what a chocolate pot kind of looked like, and so they were finding them in the field, and they thought, I wonder if we can test to see if this held chocolate. And they actually worked with Hershey's, and they did testing with Hershey's with scrapings of those pots, and they were able to determine there is chocolate residue. And so now we know when we find a particular shaped pot in the field for the Maya, we know it's a chocolate pot. So when we do that kind of thing with other types of pottery too, that's the main time where we wouldn't wash something. And then, and my students are used to hearing me compare this to the Maya a lot because that's my particular specialty. There are certain types of tools that we would maybe not wash because there might be blood residue on there that you can test for on particular types of tools. But here, most likely what we would do is wash everything except for maybe really old pottery. We might leave the inside. If we had a nice big sample, we would maybe leave the inside. If it is requested, that's one thing, but it has to really go through a lot of approval, and especially where there may be Native American remains. That is usually only done when those remains are at risk, and the archaeologists are there to try and help preserve that as much as possible. And if that means that they have to be removed, unfortunately, a lot of times archaeologists say like, just don't disturb it, construct on top of it, leave them in place. And this is an area where my answer would be very different if you asked me about that in Belize, because it's a very different culture there. Personally, I do a lot of bioarchaeology, and I do find human remains, but I also work with Maya people. They excavate with me. Their culture is not one of we're disturbing the dead. It's part of Maya culture to re-enter burials, so it's not as taboo, and that's different. In this area where we may come across Native American remains, the idea is you do not want to disturb that. And then when it comes for cemeteries, later cemeteries, historic cemeteries, again, a lot of times sometimes it can be just trying to identify burials. So if you don't have the markers aren't there anymore, and it's being requested, that does happen where a group or a city will ask for archaeologists' help to help re-identify locations of burials, because it's much safer to have an archaeologist do that with our methods than it is to go in there just trying to dig and find people. So in that case, yes. We would never attempt that on a field school. We were. So anytime because we found lots and lots of bone throughout our excavations, and luckily I could easily identify human versus animal. So I was like, we're good on all of the bone we found.
Half of the cemetery is washed away, more than half. It's been washed away by 2 floods.
Mm-hmm. Oh, and
Pazuelo Garzas, yes.
And so you probably don't have.
It goes back to the early 1800s.
Oh wow! Now, I love historic cemetery. My daughter's name actually came from a historic cemetery. And a lot of times there are archaeologist groups, if a town, a precinct, or what have you, wants to have that re-identified, archaeologists will take old cemetery maps, if there are historic records, and try and re-identify, because that has happened where they try and get new markers up for people, because a lot of times it's just the markers that have washed away.
This is
bodies too.
It's in the family, so I know the history.
There's actually a lot of native burial there. A lot.
Yeah, and in the case that if there are native burials there too, in that case, it's not just a matter of getting the town or municipality and landowners involved. It would also be working with the Native American Graves Repatriation Protection Act, NAGPRA. We would work very, very closely with that to make sure that is accepted by them, and we would work in conjunction with that law as well.
Legends that Native Americans are buried there.
Yeah, so they probably are.
And it's haunted, that part of it.
Oh, yeah.
No, that's private.
It is private.
Private of it.
Yeah,
So that's the one case
Lots of
where
people
the
have
private
owned
land ownership does not apply, is when it comes to Native American graves. In which case, that can be, you're not supposed to disturb the graves or any goods, any artifacts that may be associated with those graves. You are not. And that is unfortunately relatively recent. That is not a long-standing law, and you can get in big trouble. In fact, a number of cases have come up where they're actually going after collectors. Again, mostly those that have collected from public lands and things like that have collections in their homes that include human remains.
Yep.
So, and that's good, but it's a long time coming. Unfortunately, that was